No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 24 in season 3. Summer has been traditionally a time for this podcast when we step away from our normal episode series to relax and have a little fun. During the past 2 summers, we've looked at sci-fi and horror movies, but this summer, we are rewatching the Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House. So, listeners, if you've been watching or reading or however you're approaching the Hill House series this summer with us, we have been talking about the television program, The Haunting of Hill House, in our main episodes. And then in our off-week Patreon episodes, we've been talking about the book, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and comparing and contrasting characters and talking about the adaptation. So our $5 a month Patreon supporters have been getting more of a comparison contrast between the novel and the Netflix program. But in these main episodes, we've been taking the Netflix program, The Haunting of Hill House, that came out last October, and breaking it down 3 episodes of the show per our episodes. So if you haven't watched The Haunting of Hill House, you should probably go ahead and do that because we are spoiling a lot. And also, sometimes you don't necessarily have to listen to the podcast sequentially, but it would probably be good for this summer series to listen to our last 2 episodes before this one. Because today we're going to be talking about episode 7 to the end. So we're talking about the last 4 episodes. And these are a lot happens basically in these last 4 episodes. Before we started recording, before we started with the introduction to Shirley Jackson's book, we were already talking about how emotionally disturbed and overwrought we've been from following these characters to the end of the program, and talking a little bit about some of the really emotional moments, which I'm sure we'll talk about in this recording. At the risk of we always feel like we're pitching it to Lisa because this is her first watch through of The Haunting of Hill House, and getting her reactions. Matt and I are watching it again. I'm going to pitch it to you, Lisa, to give us what we'll do first is a little bit of a summary of what happened in the episodes, but then we want the majority of this discussion to be about it as a whole, like how we see it progressing. So Lisa, give us some of your thoughts about the last 4 episodes.
Oh boy, do I have thoughts. Okay. Well, Mel, as you said, we are discussing the last 4 episodes of the series. So episodes 7, 8, 9, and 10. And Matt, thank you for reading the intro to this episode. That is the from Shirley Jackson's book. And I have complained in other episodes when we were talking about the series that they have butchered some of Jackson's words and have made me mad. They made me mad again with this because they changed something very key in that section and tagged it on to the end, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So let's start with episode 7. What I'm going to do is just really briefly remind listeners of what these episodes were about, and then we can jump into our discussion. So the first episode we're going to talk about is episode 7. It's Eulogy. And this one seems to be, every episode seems to follow more closely one of the characters, one of the Crane family members. And this one seems to be more of Hugh's episode. We get to see more of him. And he has been largely silent, both kind of as a character, but also in the narrative in the TV show up to this point. So I was really interested to hear his his kind of background. So we finally see in this episode that he's talking to his ghost wife. Although we learn later that it's not really her ghost, it's more of a coping mechanism for him. He's imagining her, and that helps him with his grief. He says, of course, I can fix it a whole lot. But at this point, we learn some of the history of Hill House. Because in the flashbacks, we see him trying to fix Hill House, and there's a lot of mold problems in the house. This is after the big storm. They discover mold running all through the 3 floors of the house. At one point, they say this could ruin us. There was this nice little image. There's a lot of good imagery, but there was this nice little image too when they were looking at the mold, and he kept seeing like the outline of a person there, which was kind of fun. But anyway, so he gets professionals in to help him tackle the mold. But at this point, we also see his wife acting really strange. In fact, at one point, I don't know, it may be Mr. Dudley who says this, but he says the missus is acting scattered. And that's when they determine that she needs to go away for a while. Hugh tries to break into the red room, and frustratingly, he can't. And we just generally see the mom acting kind of crazy at this point. We also see her try to, I guess, kill her husband with a screwdriver to the neck. And we see the crazy blueprint. But the main thing in this episode, I would say, is that we really see, at least in the past, some of the history of Hill House, mainly that he finds a body in the wall, which turns out to be William Hill, who had been missing since 1948, they say. And it was a very Poe moment, I thought, which I really appreciated. You know, this idea of somebody either being walled into a house or walling themselves into a house, because there was the idea of laying the brick wall and the scratching to get out. And it really reminded me of the Cask of Amontillado in a really kind of wonderful way. And then in the present, at the funeral home, the model dream house is broken. The future home that is sitting in Shirley's office is broken. And really interestingly, we see Dad and Theo both see a ghost. And so that is kind of the traumatic climax of that episode. Am I leaving anything out with episode 7?
I don't think so, except I think the very end of episode 7 is when we see the red room door open for the first time.
That's right, because that's going to become important, right? Yeah.
And Mr. Dudley tells him a little bit about how Clara was affected by the house, but I think you might have mentioned that one.
Yeah, he gets because that's when Hugh decides that his wife needs to leave, because he basically gets kind of the Dudley's backstory of they don't stay after dark, and he had to keep his wife away, and they've kept their children away, and they've made these very definite decisions about the house because the house makes people crazy, which I thought was interesting. So moving on into episode 8, Witness Marks was the title of that one. We see a little bit of flashback with Stephen and his wife. They are trying for IVF. And this is one of the mysteries that's kind of solved at this point, because we knew from previous episodes that he had been with his wife and then kind of abruptly separated from her, but we don't know why up until this point. So we learned that they've been trying for a baby, and because they're a family of secrets, we learn later that Stephen's been keeping like this huge secret, and that he had a vasectomy when he was young because he didn't want to pass down the crazy genes, so to speak. And but he didn't tell his wife, which is kind of a crappy thing to do, and she rightly was upset with him. But in that office, he sees his mother's ghost. I guess it's his mother's ghost. It was through some fuzzy glass, but I'm assuming that's who it was.
I think it was. It's hard to tell.
And then I don't know if I just didn't pick up on this before, because this show is sneaky. But apparently, when they kind of flash us to the current time, and it's after Nell's funeral, and Luke has run off, Stephen and Hugh go out looking for him, but then we learned that it's Halloween, which up until that point when they were taking their kids trick-or-treating, I did not realize that all of this was happening in like spooky time.
Yeah, I didn't either. I mean, I guess it's because the weather was different because they'd be in California and then Boston, but yeah.
Yeah, I had not picked up on that, and I mean, it was fine. It added a little bit to it, but it was one of those things where this story is so creepy, honestly, that it could have happened at any point in time. But I guess I kind of appreciate the fact that they said it at Halloween, but then waited until episode 8 to let you know that it was happening at Halloween.
Yeah, it's nice that it's not in your face from the beginning that it's Halloween. That would have felt
Right.
a little trite, a little contrived.
Mhm.
Just a little bit. I mean, it's like one movie could do it, could like set a horror story at Halloween and go all in, and they could do it. But then after Halloween did it, it was kind of like, okay, any other movie or TV show that does that, it's gonna feel a little overdone. So I kind of like that. But I also liked that, as Shirley is trying to deal with the fact that she thinks her sister and her husband might be having an affair, and her brother is off and maybe like going out for drugs and or killing himself. She tries to put together the little model of the forever home and finds all this mold in there, which is really kind of cool because we've seen the porch lights flashing already on that little thing. And so it's clear that there is a connection between the little model home and whatever is happening at Hill House, which I appreciate. I love when horror movies and TV shows do things in miniature. I just love it anyway.
Oh yeah, well, and part of the reason Hugh realizes Liv is having such issues is because she makes little versions of the forever home in Hill House. So she was already making that connection without realizing it when Hill House was picking at her.
Right. And that's one thing that's going to come full circle later that we've talked about, but that basically all of the children still call Hill House home, and it becomes their forever home in many different ways.
Literally,
but they never quite make it to what they imagine as they're going to be their forever home, which is kind of cool. So a little bit, we learn a little bit about Poppy and William Hill, who apparently they were both crazy and married and met in an asylum. And Mel, I know we talked about this earlier, but for our listeners, that this was one part of the show that kind of frustrated me in that it introduced this Hill family, but it was so scattered that it was hard to follow a narrative, except there was a family with a bunch of people with the last name Hill, and they lived in the house, and the house ate them. Like that was summary. Basically what happened to them. But we do get Poppy and William, who were crazy and married, and they lived in the house. But we get this really great scene with Shirley where she starts hearing the knocking, first from the door and then kind of all over, and it culminates when she's having a fight with Theo. That was a really creepy scene. And it was literally just them standing there and hearing knocking all around, but it felt so violent. Like, for a scene that showed absolutely no gore, no blood, it was just, I don't know. I don't know if that scene affected you guys, but I felt like that was one of the most terrifying scenes.
Oh, it was creepy. And it was a good callback to what happened to them as kids and also to stuff from the book.
Which comes back in a future episode of like poltergeist-like activity that happened with Eleanor Vance in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we learn at this point and through flashbacks that, of course, there's a theme of this family like keeping secrets and not talking. And part of not talking to each other is they don't ever learn what's really going on individually with the children, which has been a problem. Because we learn at this point, we always thought Stephen, or at least I always thought Stephen was just immune to the house because he was the one who didn't believe. And he was the one who did not see anything, apparently. But he did. He just didn't know what he saw. So, for instance, we learned in this episode that the clock repairman that he sees is actually a ghost, which was kind of a cool little creepy thing.
I'd like to jump in.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in with that, too, because having rewatched it and also read all the BuzzFeed-like articles after I watched it about all the hidden ghosts, I think that that's a great metaphor for first-time viewers, because there's a lot of hidden ghosts in the house throughout the show that you don't notice necessarily on a first watch. There were some that I caught, but they were the obvious ones. But they're everywhere in this show. So we're all Stephen that first time, and I kind of find that interesting. I was completely
Stephen. Well, and that was one where I had caught some of the early ghosts. But when I saw the clock repair guy or whoever he was, I was like, dude looks weird. So that didn't surprise me so much when they were like, it's a ghost. But then right after that, you also, at least this is where I figured it out, or where I learned it, that the treehouse wasn't real.
Right.
And that slapped me upside the face. So at that point, I was just like, oh, I have to watch this a second time. Like, I'm going to have to submit myself to the torture of this show again just to figure all this out. Oh, and you also had that really effectively. It was completely a jump scare, but with the two sisters, Shirley and Theo, in the car. Of course, they're going to Hill House because they figure out that that's where Luke is going, and that's where their dad and their brother are going. So they decide they have to head there, and dead sister pops up in the back seat. I nearly peed myself.
Yeah,
it's shocking.
Lie. It was a well done jump scare.
It was a well done jump scare, and I stand by a well done jump scare, because sometimes it can feel cheap. It did not feel that way here. It got
and their
me.
reactions were priceless to it too, because Shirley's just like calmly walking because she's in shock, and Theo is just screaming for the first time in the show, like, did you not see that? And like, yeah, the first time I watched it, I was like really like into Theo's emotional thing, obviously, because it's really well acted and great writing there. But yeah, you just have to almost laugh because Shirley's just like, la la la, there's a ghost in my backseat, you know.
Well, I was surprised by the fact that they got back in the car after that. I mean, number one, I don't know. Like, I know they feel like they have to get to Hill House, but at that point, I'm thinking I'd be like calling an Uber or something, because there's no way I'd be getting back in that car.
Yeah, I guess the sense of urgency for Luke overrode the fear, but yeah,
and I get that.
I agree.
I get it. But at the same time, I'm like, they're getting back in the car. But they did.
If I had a dead sibling pop out of the backseat of my car, I would never drive it again. Like, that's just...
Well, and it wasn't even the pretty dead sibling that they get later. It's the, like, white-eyed, covered in some sort of weird ghost mold sibling. It was terrifying. Anyway, that was pretty much gets us to the end of episode 8. So I'm going to go ahead and push forward so that we can get these next two out of the way. Episode 9 was Screaming Mimi's, which I loved the name of that. And this is where we get more on the mom, more of kind of her story. And we also get Poppy Hill, who ended up being kind of a cool character, even if she did not make sense to me.
And she maybe killed her kids.
Yeah. Well, we see Luke befriending Abigail, which he had always had that friend of the woods. And then we see Mom's reading room, and kind of where she goes. But now this was really cool, because at one point she's been having kind of waking nightmares and really bad headaches, but we actually see one of them, and she kind of crosses into the present and sees Eleanor on the morgue table, which at this point I think we had only really seen the present day characters stepping back into the past.
Yeah, except for Bentnick Lady, this is the first time the house has shown a future to a character.
Right. And I really liked that. And this is another reason I'm going to have to watch the episodes again. I love the way it's playing with time.
Mm-hmm.
The way it bends over together, and I just love it.
It's also just despicably evil because it makes her see the future that it partially created. The future would have been different if it hadn't made her do what she did to herself.
Right. Well, and we'll kind of get that because as we get more of her story in this episode, it's really kind of heartbreaking because you see, I mean, we already knew the house was affecting her, and it was affecting her the most, and we knew that she didn't survive the last night in Hill House. But this is the first time we're really getting more of this. So we see her, and she says at a point, I'm a dream. Or no, Poppy says that, I'm sorry. I'm a dream and so are you and so are we. But there's becomes this idea of this through line of waking up. Having a bad dream and waking up, you know. And the idea of needing to protect her children. Because at some point she talks about, you know, I always thought we were supposed to prepare our children for the world and get them ready to go out, but now I feel the need to keep them as close to me as I can. She has a creepy moment where she and I can't remember if it's in this episode or an earlier one, where she says she wants to keep the twins young. She's like, I wish I could just freeze them now. Because the other kids grew up so fast and they don't need their mother anymore, which is a really relatable feeling. I mean, listen, my youngest is starting kindergarten in a month, and I've been a mess about it, you know, because you're just like, oh my gosh, they grow up so fast. So it's a very relatable thing, but it turns bad so quickly because the twins are being creepy at one point, or at least she sees them. We learn later this does not happen. But they basically say, like, why would you kill us? Why would you send us out into the darkness? You know, and she becomes convinced that she has to protect them. Basically, the house is messing with her. We actually see her leaving, but she lies. She goes to that weird hotel and then comes back. And then she says she's going to have a tea party, which we already knew because there had already been moments with tea parties. And Eleanor had already said she'd had a tea party with somebody who wasn't her mother. So we knew this was not going to turn out well. And then, of course, the camera lingers on the rat poison. And at that point, you're just kind of buckling in. Like, this is not going to be good. Abigail is there, and she sees Abigail. They're having the tea party in the red room. Now, I did not realize, and this is another time when the show slapped me in the face, until Abigail drinks the tea, that Abigail was a real girl.
I'm so glad you said that. So glad you said that, because as we were watching it, my wife and I had a running debate as to whether or not Abigail was a ghost. And I was on Team Ghost because I kept going back to Luke's episode, which is one of the only times you really actually see her and don't just hear about her. And he says, nobody believes me, nobody listens to me, they don't even think you're real. And so I thought, he's playing with a ghost. He thinks the ghost is real. It's a Sixth Sense thing. Nope, she was alive. I was totally...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I realized
shocked.
She was real when she comes in and sees her sleeping in the bed because Mrs. Dudley had just said she had a girl that she was homeschooling and never let in the house. So when they said something about it was, can she stay? I was like, oh no, it's a real person.
Well, yeah, okay.
This is bad.
To be fair, I think that was the moment where I realized it. It wasn't the tea party, but it was in this episode, not earlier. We went from Luke's episode, which is like episode 3, 4, to now.
Yeah. It was episode 4.
We had this running debate. Like, no, I think that little yellow-haired girl is a ghost. No, she's not. Yeah. So.
Well, you know, must have been late to the party on this one because I just took it on face value that Abigail was a ghost this whole time. And Mel, it wasn't until I saw her in the bed and I realized her clothes did not look quite old enough to be like a Poppy ghost. You know, like Poppy clearly walked out of like the 20s or 30s or wherever she walked out of. You know, but her clothes look, but you know, they tricked us with that haircut.
Yeah.
Well, the haircut,
you know,
and I think her clothing too is modern-ish, but it's also, it looks kind of almost homemade. Exactly.
Right.
Which
just
it probably
like Clara's
is.
Clothes. Yeah.
Right.
It probably is homemade, but that seems, to our more modernized, a more dated thing. That's something that would be more likely to happen in the 40s or 50s, not something in the, when the Cranes were there, I guess the 80s-ish. So,
well, and that's one thing that made me, I guess I just took it at face value that she was a ghost, and it wasn't until I saw her lying in the bed. But then I thought, you know, this is so smart. It wasn't, again, until the tea room that I realized, okay, she's definitely a little girl. But I was not questioning it the whole time. But it just goes to show you, because this is why I want to go back and like rewatch too, and I think this is what Hill House does, is Hill House forces people to keep secrets from one another. Because I mean, there's no way like that one of my children could have a friend and I would not know it. You know what I mean? Or have somebody sleep over my house and me not know it. But in a big place like Hill House, and in a place where everybody is dealing with their own kind of nightmare and nobody is really telling each other the whole truth, you can see how easily something like that does happen. Anyway, I'm going to stop right there because more comes out in episode 10. So, but we do, and this is where it's really good at, I guess, pulling on our heartstrings, because of course, little Abigail is real and she does die. Liv kills herself. We see her throwing her, well, first we see Hugh save the twins. And we also learn how the mom got this like fractured skull and all that because he was literally pushing her away. That was a question for a while, you know, what was happening with that. And did he have anything to do with it? But she does kill herself, but it's really heartbreaking in the way she does it because she wants to wake up from the nightmare. You know, she basically says, if this is all a bad dream, like, why can't I wake up? And then you have Poppy kill her.
Yeah, I was just about to say, it wasn't, on my first watching, I kind of felt like she jumped, but my second watching, yeah, you can see Poppy push her.
Yeah. I mean, she was hovering. Mm-hmm. she was hovering on the edge. But Poppy did help her over. But we get that beautiful kind of flashback to the first day of Hill House. So I love the way they did the parallel of the last night at Hill House and then the first day at Hill House, because you get the heartbreaking lines of the children running in excited. And Liv says, "You guys go on without me." And they run off happily. And Hugh turns around with this great big smile on his face and says, "How could we?" And at that point, the TV show fully broke me. So it took a while before I could watch episode 10, honestly.
Well, and that would be a good place too. I just want to jump in with, I like how it makes, once again, that playing with time, that it becomes this very circular thing. And I think that even almost goes into what you were saying about Hill House causing everyone to be isolated from each other and keep secrets, is that it kind of becomes this closed loop of itself where it's like a record repeating, you know?
Yeah.
They're kind of trapped in this loop, and that's, I mean, we haven't touched on it much this episode, but we did mention it, I think, in the last episode, that a lot of this show is about grief. And I mean, if you don't deal with and process your grief, that's exactly what it is this loop that keeps repeating itself, and you keep reliving that loss. So I like that, the way that episode ends. And yeah, it broke me too, just seeing it the first time was very much a punch in the gut.
Oh, yeah. just put it mildly, a punch in the gut. Well, let's go ahead and talk about episode 10 so we can kind of talk about the series as a whole and kind of the cool stuff that it does, because I agree with you, Matt. It is so much about grief, and I want to talk about that. Well, let's talk about episode 10, which is titled Silence Lays Steadily, which, of course, is from that opening quote that we started this episode with. At this point, we learn a little bit more about the Red Room. And I kind of already knew that, so this wasn't a huge thing, because by the time I learned the treehouse wasn't real, you learned that the Red Room is essentially, they call it at one point the heart of the house and the stomach of the house. So it's where it draws you in, so that, I forget who says it, the house draws you into the Red Room, basically, so that you will sit still while it can eat you alive, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also learned that all the kids have been there at one point. It was a nursery for Poppy. She says that at one point when she's speaking to Liv. Of course, it was Liv's reading room. It was the dance room or studio or whatever for Theo. There's also that great scene of where you see what was happening way back when in Theo's episode, when she was dancing, and it sounds like somebody's trying to get into the house, get into the room. You learn that was actually her siblings on the other side trying to open the door to the Red Room.
Which I loved, because they play.
So
it plays
good.
for a great scare moment in Theo's episode, because it's the creepy haunted house with the doorknob rattling and nobody on the other side, when in fact it wasn't. But really nice.
But it also makes you question like every other weird thing you've seen in this show. Like
Yes.
going back to the episode where Theo and Shirley were arguing in the parlor of the funeral home, and it sounds like people are beating on the door and windows, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, who is that really on the other side? Is that, Hill House manifesting a haunting, or is that where time is looping in on itself again? But they weren't in the Red Room then, so I don't know. But the Red Room was the treehouse for Luke. It was the kind of toy room, tea party place for Eleanor. It was a game room for Steve at one point. And it was a family room for Shirley. So they learn at that point that they've all been in the house. So at this point, you basically have all the living members of the Hill family in Hill House, or the Hill family, of the Crane family, in Hill House at once. Like, this is all here. They're all trying to save Luke. Of course, they find Luke later. They try to revive him because apparently he has OD'd. But one thing I think is really cool is you see Hill House kind of messing with them for a final time. And it gives each of the characters these nice little sliding doors version of their lives.
Yeah, it definitely identifies each of the characters' weaknesses and starts to play on those.
Yeah. So, for instance, we see Stephen and his wife, and it looks like time has passed, and they've gotten together, and she's pregnant. They've named the little girl Eleanor. That goes horrifically wrong, and I don't want to talk about that scene because it was traumatic.
Yes.
Because even when I saw his wife pregnant sitting there, I was like, oh, they're doing a flash forward. And then I was like, no, they're not. Oh, my gosh, he's still in Hill House. This scene also bothered me a little bit because he was, I guess, trying to write a sequel to his book. And he said, his wife goes, read me aloud what you have. And he says, okay, some houses are born bad. And then he goes, oh, is that too much? And it made me so mad because I was like, okay, you're literally criticizing Shirley Jackson's words.
Yeah. This is the episode where a lot of the dialogue is just literally pulled from the novel. Through a lot of characters' mouths. Yeah.
A lot of it. So that kind of made me mad, but whatever. Okay, we get back to Hill House. We realize that Stephen is finally accepting that he's seeing the ghosts. you learn a little bit more about Shirley and her past, that she had an affair. Although in the sliding door version of her life, she turned down the guy who was trying to sleep with her and have the affair with her. I don't know. I mean, that was fine. It was a little bit heartbreaking to see all the characters see the mistakes that they had made, mainly mistakes that they had made because of who Hill House had made them. Only to see the kind of rug pulled out from under their feet and realize that life wasn't good and life was still bad and they were still in Hill House and things were not okay. But Ghost Nell does show up, and she's the pretty version this time, and she essentially saves her siblings, which I appreciated. But at this point, Hill House, the TV show, is messing with time and kind of messing with our minds. And I guess we ought to just talk about the ending. The siblings kind of all get to say that they're sorry to Nell. So you kind of feel like that there's closure there. They get to apologize for all the things they didn't do to help her. And she ends up saying, it's okay. She has this lovely line where she says, I loved you completely and you loved me the same. That's all. The rest is confetti. So kind of just the idea that we loved each other and that's okay. Like that doesn't go away, which I thought was good. And the dad kind of gets his closure too, because he ends up helping to save his children and get them out of the house. And he has the lovely meeting with his real ghost wife. And he convinces her to let the children go, basically. She wants her children with her. So she is kind of complicit in Hill House killing them, I guess. He says, let the children go. She says, I'll be alone again. They have, again, Mel, the ripping off of Shirley Jackson's words, where they say,
Journeys end in lovers meeting.
Yes.
But they don't end. They don't end, Lisa. Journeys don't end.
Journeys don't end. That's what we learned there, is that journeys don't end. So Dad opens the door. The girls are able to get their brother to the hospital. He makes Steve, and this is that part I kind of bothered me because I didn't understand why he was putting it all on Steve. But he keeps him behind and basically says, guess what? We just lived through hell and now you own it. And now you've got to be the one to bear this. But he does end up telling his son, or he shows him basically what happened that night. And so we learn that Abigail is indeed the Dudley's daughter, and that the Dudleys kept the secret basically because they didn't want people to destroy Hill House, because that was now their one connection to their daughter. So they were like, we're just going to pretend she's not here anymore. Like nobody apparently knew her other than them, because they were so like reclusive and protective of her, that they were like, we can just bury her in the backyard and nobody will know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That always works.
Well, again, but I think that speaks to how Hill House has probably, even though the Dudleys have think they escaped all these years, Hill House has turned them into that, I think. Hill House has turned them into these reclusive people and these very secretive people. And
oh yeah, they kept Abigail in the house because they kept Abigail in their home because they didn't want Hill House to kill her. So, I mean, it still happened, but
right. Yeah. So, I mean, Hill House had been working on them this whole time too, but basically, so that was what happened. I guess there were 3 or 4 hours that were missing that the police had been interviewing Hugh about, that we learn at this point. That it was basically like, we're just going to pretend like your wife did not kill our daughter. We know it wasn't her. We know it was Hill House. So we're just going to like accept that we have a ghost child now. And we're going to come visit her whenever we can. And there is that nice little scene of them old. I guess he like rushes his dying wife over to Hill House so she can die in Hill House.
To be with the baby and Abigail.
Right.
Yeah.
Which was kind of sweet. But this is the problem. Okay, so dad offs himself in a very small way. Small meaning everything. So much happened in this episode that like I feel like if you blink, you miss the fact that he had taken these pills. So he kills himself to be with his wife. So his wife's not alone, but the children get out and they're safe. And then we see a flash forward where the kids are okay. Theo has, I guess, gotten married or is at least living happily with her girlfriend. Shirley and her husband have reconciled. They're okay. Luke is 2 years sober. He's celebrating 2 years sobriety. He also, in a very nice thing, has 7 people. There's 7 people around that cake. So they're back to 7, even though they've lost some of their numbers. So you feel like it's a happy ending, but because the TV show has messed with our minds so much, I don't trust anything. And Matt, I know you had read something on an alternate ending, and I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yes, and part of me would have liked this alternate ending, and part of me is really glad they didn't do it, because by the end I felt like I had been beaten up by this show mentally. But the alternate ending that the writers had toyed with for this last sequence was at some point towards the end of it to show in the background a red door and just sort of hint and imply that no, this ending isn't happy and they're actually still trapped in that red room. Sorry, thanks for playing. And I feel like I think both endings work for this show. Part of me thinks, yes, that would be a very nice poetic ending to have it all be. That's the good horror story ending, is to have it all be another version of Hill House messing with them and they're still trapped in the red room. And then the other part of me is like, man, they deserved it. Let them have the happy ending. I need the happy ending after the 10 hours of this show. Dear God, we all need the happy ending. So, but yeah, I was very... Because I kept, like, waiting for that other shoe to drop, kind of like you seemed like you were, Lisa. Like kept waiting, like, okay, after everything the show has done, is this a happy ending? Is it really? And I really didn't trust it, and I guess having read that after watching the show the first time, I was right not to trust it, because the original intention was not to trust it. So, yeah, if you hadn't heard that before, listeners, yeah, I thought it was a really cool little tidbit there.
I needed the happy ending. I needed some of the characters to at least have a happy ending. I needed that. But yeah, I don't trust it.
You still don't trust it?
I mean, I no. I think
the cake was red at the end.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I liked, and this is another reason I want to go back and rewatch the show, is because when I learned that the Red Room had been different things for different people, and when you go back and look, the set design, they all have that one like skinny rectangular window in the back, so you can see it is clearly the same room that has just been done up differently. And when I went back and looked, because I had to check, I know that there was a red cake, but I had to check that there was no window in the back of the scene where he's having his sobriety party, and there wasn't. So that makes me feel a little bit better that they're not still stuck in the red room. But I just don't trust anything that I see now with this show, because I am questioning everything, and it's going to require at least another watch. I'm going to have to build up some fortitude before I do that, though.
I feel like, and this is probably a really great way to segue into one of the things that we wanted to talk about just with the show as a whole, because we had kind of mentioned it teasingly earlier about the theme of grief. I kind of feel like this ending is an appropriate ending for that, just because if you take the whole show as a metaphor for grief, once you reach kind of that last real stage of grief, that acceptance of it, that is kind of when you start to move on. And in the case of the Cranes, let's say, they finally hit that point of acceptance, that that last night, that second last night in Hill House, I guess, if you will. But you could kind of see it as also, grieving for Eleanor. Grief takes time, and like 2 years is not unheard of, especially if it's the loss of a sibling. I mean, it's even once you get over the grief part of it, it's still going to be a lifelong thing where there will still be moments of missing and longing that person that was in your life. But I mean, it makes sense that, okay, we're at about a 2-year place because we have that mile marker with Luke's sobriety there as a nice little subtle way of saying it's been 2 years since everything that kind of happened in this big climax sort of scene. Yeah, that kind of makes sense, as that would be about the time that they would all be really, really through it all and really moving on from the loss of a sibling. So, and I'm using that as a nice way to open the door for that article that you shared with us, Lisa. Hint, hint.
Hint. No, I will take that and run with it. No, so Matt, you had mentioned earlier, when we were kind of running through the episodes, that so much of this show is about grief. And this is a working theory I've had for a while, not even specifically about this show, but just about the horror genre in general. And the first part of this I've stolen from somebody, and I wish I could give credit, but my brain is not working right now. But I had read somewhere that all literature and is basically at its heart about the cost of human connection. Like, what does it cost you to be close with somebody? Because that's a lot. I mean, that's really a lot when you think about it, like really to have a true connection with somebody. And if that's really what all literature is about at its core, then in my theory, horror literature it's not about being terrified or horrified or scared. It's really about the loss of that connection. So if you do make a true human connection with someone and then you lose them, then horror literature and horror films are about the grief that follows. So basically, at its heart, horror is about grief. And that's just kind of a working theory I'm going with right now. But then I read this really interesting article that I found on BuzzFeed. It was written by Nora Dominic, and this was published in October of 2018. So some of our listeners may have seen it, but it basically says that the 5 Crane siblings are essentially the 5 stages of grief. So if you're not familiar with them, you've got first denial, then anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance, which is what you were talking about, Matt. And if you follow the Crane siblings in order from oldest to youngest, they line up with each of these. So Steve is denial, clearly. He's the one who from the very beginning does not believe in anything supernatural. Shirley is anger, which is very clear towards the end. And they even call her out on some of that, that she has so much anger towards everyone. Theo would be bargaining. We see that. We didn't really talk about that, but she talks at one point about how she lost her ability to feel anything after her sister died. And she was just pleading for it to come back, specifically after she touched her sister's body. Luke would be depression, and Nell is finally accepted. Yeah, so I found this really interesting because Nell, if she is accepted, she's the one who does return home first. Home being Hill House, and kind of accept the fact that it is home for her. And other siblings have to come to that conclusion. She was also the one who really held, her and Luke. And Luke was only one step away from this, from accepting it. They were the only ones who really kind of fully knew everything that had happened that night.
Yeah.
Because even though they didn't know about fully the cover up of what had happened with Abigail, they witnessed their mother poisoning Abigail. And they witnessed their father saving them. That was something that the older siblings didn't know. So they have more to come to term with later than Luke does. And then, of course, I guess Nell does, but Nell doesn't really factor into this anymore.
Well, I think that also, I hadn't really thought of this until I was looking over this article that you sent, Lisa, but I think that also explains, might be too strong of a word, but illustrates the relationship between Nell and Olivia in Hill House after their death. Because Olivia is forever stuck. I mean, the hellish kind of end for her is that she is forever stuck not knowing what's real and what's not. And she is forever stuck with her idea of having to be in the forever house, and that the world is dangerous and the house is safe, which is completely messed up and makes her dangerous. And it makes sense that Nell would be acceptance in some ways, because she spends her time in the house when she's not being bent neck lady, fighting against Poppy's sociopathic helping of the house, and Olivia trying to get the kids back to the house. Like, Eleanor is one. I mean, Olivia's trying to kill Luke, putting rat poison in him and recreating the tea party and using the big boy thing. And I mean, just using everything she can to lure him into killing himself. And it's Eleanor, little Eleanor, and finally older Eleanor, who stops that. And I think that plays in the idea of acceptance. Like, Nell's in the house, but she's fighting against it because she has kind of accepted maybe what has happened and is trying to push them to move from their stages of grief. That actually makes Nell's end a little bit more comprehensible to me in some ways, that she's this kind of guide to them.
Well, she was the only one who I think really saw things clearly too, because the rest of the siblings were so focused on what had gone wrong. Steve, of course, was just, he didn't understand any of it, and he was angry with his father for not coming back, for being raised by an aunt, for not helping his mom. Shirley was angry at everybody. Luke could not get past the fact that people couldn't trust him or wouldn't believe him or refuse to believe him. And Nell was really the only one who was able to kind of transcend all that and just be like, but guys, we have each other and we love each other. And I know she reached that point really after her death, when we see her ghost trying to help her siblings, as you were saying. But even when we saw her get married, the other siblings were trying to keep Luke away to keep it a happy day for her. And if you remember, when we see her getting ready, the only thing she wants is Luke there. She makes no comment about, I will have him here as long as he's clean, or, whatever. She just wants her family together. Mm-hmm. And so she does seem to be the one who can kind of rise above everything that Hill House is throwing at them and being like, but guys, we're awesome together. We're a family. We love each other. What more do you want? So yeah, in that way, she really does fit the acceptance role and kind of always has. And she ends up being that guiding force to help them get over all of it too, which I like that.
One of the themes that I thought was really interesting in the show, and I think we've talked about this a few times, and it kind of branches off of what we were saying with Eleanor. I'm interested in what you guys think about this too, is we have talked, I think, in each of our episodes about the idea of home and what makes a home, and the fact that Hill House corrupts their idea of the forever home. And for me, I really love the character of Olivia. And that was part of what made me feel for her as she gradually was taken in by the house and was pleading for help and couldn't get the help that she needed. I don't know. When I get to the end of this, I totally see the stages of grief. I see how Nell is helping them. I love the fact that they are learning how to get over their grief. But for me, the idea that I have two issues here. One is I feel like the show is also saying something about maybe motherhood and our expectations of motherhood, and that's what kind of brings Olivia down to a certain extent. And then the other thing I wonder is, Hill House was evil the whole time, preying on these people. But then at the end, it kind of does become a forever home for these people who have died. Like Hugh and Eleanor and Olivia get to be together, so Olivia's not alone. And Mrs. Dudley gets to be a mother to the baby she never got to mother because it was stillborn in Hill House, and to Abigail, who was taken from her by Olivia and her twisted idea of mothering. So I was just interested in what you guys thought about this idea of like home and house. Like Hill House is evil, but then it's also the place where the families go together, like in this ghost container. Um, and then like Olivia and how she's brought down by these competing ideas of motherhood. Maybe that's incoherent, but those are my thoughts.
I feel like what you were. I want to tackle your second one first, real quick, because I feel like that is sort of. That's sort of what. Well, that's sort of what the show was about. Is like, yes, they've survived these horrible things, and yet, at the end, it's what brought them all together. I mean, it's what divided them, but it also ultimately brings them together in a closer way. And I know I've said before, I don't remember which other episode it was, but I mean, if you subtract the haunting part of this show, it's still a fantastic family narrative about family and dysfunction and whatnot. And I think Hill House being a forever home, being two sides of that coin, I think is totally a way to read this, where it was the thing that separated them, but ultimately it did bring them closer together as a family. It involved substantial pain and loss, but it did ultimately bring them together. And also, yeah, the motherhood thing, I did want to like throw my 2 cents in on that as well. I totally agree with you, and about how isolating our sense of motherhood can be for a lot of mothers who feel like they have to be the perfect mother, who has to have the perfect family, has to have it all together. I mean, it's why postpartum depression is even still a really hard thing for people to admit that they have, when we know that it's a very real thing. And I think societal expectations play a part in that. But I would even say and I kind of wanted to say this earlier, I think it was when Lisa was giving the recap of one of the episodes about how Olivia says that, I want to protect the twins from the dangers of the world. My other kids have grown up and kind of don't need me anymore, but the twins still need me, and I want to keep them near and young forever and protect them. That's a normal sentiment for any parent, but when taken to an extreme, that's, I think, what you hear a lot of from the parents of, like, the parents who kill their children while they're young, who drive into a lake with their kids in the back seat, or drown them in a tub, all those horrible things that we hear about. Some of them, the ones that were, didn't kill themselves, have said something along those lines. I mean, it's that warped idea of protecting their kids and keeping them innocent.
That's such a good point that you brought that up, because I think I had brought up in one of the earlier episodes, Liv wears that necklace, that pendant that Nell wants so badly. And it's the one that she finally gets in a really twisted way in episode 5, which kind of which does lead to her downfall. But Liv had that pendant that had the twins' pictures in it. And I remember saying, why does she have a picture only of 2 of her children? When she's got 5 children. Like, that's a very strange thing to do. And I think that should have been our first hint that, and there's probably more all through this show. I need to go back and rewatch so many times now. But that she did take that kind of normal attachment, like you said, Matt, to a warped place. Because when it is taken to an extreme, it is very dangerous. We see that both with Liv and her compulsive need to protect the twins, which becomes I'm going to protect them. I'm going to wake them up from this nightmare, basically, by killing them. But we also see that with Mrs. Dudley and her obsessive need to protect Abigail.
I was just going to say that too, that like you've got that extreme example that I just gave, but also, and nothing against homeschooling your children. I mean, there are good reasons to do it, and it's not a bad thing, but if it comes to the point where they are so isolated from the outside world and all they know is your family and they have no contact, it's damaging.
We're talking not normal homeschooling here either.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. If they had been isolating Abigail to the point that if Abigail dies, nobody would, and they even say it, nobody would mourn her. They say we can bury her because there is nobody who would mourn her. That shows that they have been just as warped as Liv has.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what you said, Lisa, that the Dudleys were partially digested by Hill House too, because the Dudleys want Olivia to leave because they know Hill House is messing. Because she even says before she came to Hill House, she knew the purpose of parenting was to get the kids ready to leave. It's Hill House and Poppy that warp that. I think that scene when Mrs. Dudley first tells her, "You're right to want to protect the children," which pushes her to think more about killing them. Then Mrs. Dudley says, I can see the house is messing you up, like, go away. And I think that shows how maybe damaged the Dudleys have been by the house, that they see that Liv needs to get away, but they don't understand that they're doing similar things to her.
Okay, Mel, you're just convincing me even further that the Crane siblings did not have a happy ending, because and I completely agree with you. The Dudleys were just as partially digested as the Cranes. It bothered me that they knew enough about Hill House to stay away and to protect their daughter, yet they did not get any further than the cottage on the edge of the property. When I was watching, before even I knew that Abigail was their daughter and what was going to happen to her, I remember thinking, if you think Hill House is so bad, then number one, why are you back in it helping the people? And I get that, he explains, he's like, well, when my wife learned that it was a family with children, she felt compelled to help. Like, I get that. But at the same time, I'm thinking, if there's this evil house that is capable of killing people, so much so that you won't go into it if you can help it, I'm moving across country. Like, I'm not living close to that house. But I think one of the tricks that Hill House plays is that it does become the forever home for the people that it preys upon. And so it is as much a forever home, which of course it does become for the Dudleys, because we see that happening for them. But even before their daughter died, it was their forever home because they did not get very far from it. And it had digested them, and it was still working on them even while they were keeping their distance. So it kind of makes me wonder, even though we see a happy ending, as Matt pointed out, it's only 2 years out when we see this happy ending. I'm not convinced that they still are not being partially digested by Hill House, even at that point. That even if they have found a little bit of happiness, it might be a false security, kind of like I think the Dudleys felt with their daughter, that if we keep her home and we keep her safe and we keep her away from Hill House, we'll be okay. I wonder if the Crane siblings aren't going through that right now, where it's like, okay, we've worked through our 5 stages of grief and we've accepted that our mom and our sister are gone, but Hill House is still working upon them. So
that's a really good point. Yeah, it's depressing, but that's a good point.
We get our happy ending and we don't, which kills me. And it also kills me that I'm going to have to watch this TV show maybe 2 more times before I feel like I'm done with it. So I don't know. This was a fun first watch, and I'm glad I got to watch it with you guys. And yeah, I'm going to have to take some time off and then rewatch it again and see what I missed the first time. Now that I know everything, I want to see how well it was placed and tied in, because I imagine I missed a whole lot of kind of Easter eggs that were pointing me towards the ending I didn't know was coming. So yeah, it's going to take a while for me to digest this, kind of like Hill House.
Maybe Hill House is digesting you.
It is digesting me as I digest it.
Well, I guess that's probably a good place for us to go ahead and wrap up this summer of Shirley. And so before we go, just a reminder that your co-hosts Lisa and Mel wrote a book. From gothic ghost stories to psychological horror to science fiction, women have been the primary architects of dark speculative literature of all sorts. So satisfy your craving for extraordinary authors and exceptional fiction, meet the women writers who defied convention, to craft some of literature's strangest tales in Monster, She Wrote, a new nonfiction book by Lisa and Mel. The book will be released September 17th, but you can pre-order now by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. And also check out the show notes for a direct link to the Quirk site with to pre-order this book. Please follow us on social media. We're at NoFearCast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page too. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we really do love getting emails, send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.